Hello, everyone, and may the 4th be with you. Do we have any hardcore Star Wars fans in the audience so far today? I know I myself have only watched, I think, one movie with safe software, actually, which was quite fun, but did not really follow along because I haven't seen previous ones. What about our other panelists here today?
I'm in that same category. I think the last one I watched was when Safe rented out the movie theater. Since then, I haven't really watched any others. But growing up, I think I watched most of them. So I know the story.
I'm old enough to have seen the first one when it came out on its first release down at the Vogue Theater in Vancouver. So
I think I've seen most of them, but I can't remember the story.
Stan says, you mean have I seen all the movies in the theater even back in 1977? Yes, very cool.
Right.
All right, and it is that time, so we'll go ahead and get started with a bit of housekeeping notes here. So a couple different ways that you can ask questions this morning. So the first being in person over the air. You can raise your hand using that little raise hand icon, and we will promote you to a panelist. At that point, you can unmute and share your webcam and ask questions on the air with us. And then the second way, if you're more comfortable, is through text. So type your question into the question panel there on the GoToWebinar control panel and hit send. All right, and with that, I will pass things over to Mark.
Yeah, we've done a few webinars in the past on data quality. There's, and what does that mean? One of our customers who did a presentation with us quite a long time ago had this saying that you should trust your data suppliers, but always verify their data. And so I always thought that was kind of a gentle approach to validating data that somebody else gives you. And there are kind of three primary choices you have when it comes to data quality. Are you just identifying bad issues? So if you're a repository of data and you're accumulating other people's data, do you just identify the issues, and then if you catch bad data, you send that back to the data supplier to fix? In that process, are you taking statistics on how many issues are encountered? And then the other part of it is, well, okay, you've identified issues. Do you try and fix them, or again, send it back to who's supplying data? So yeah, it's a pretty broad brush of what falls under the category of data quality and validation, I think.
Yeah, I think we have a bit of a cheeky poll here to get started with. What best describes you? Sometimes we want to do it all, and sometimes only the first. So we'll launch a poll here and let us know, are you an identifier or more of a fixer? We'll give everyone a moment here to vote.
Well, it started as an even split. Now it's changing quite a bit.
Yeah. All right, and I'll close down the poll here and share that. Okay, so mainly fixers in the audience. That's great.
That's good, because that's a good role for FME. Yeah, and so it is quite a spectrum of data compliance or validation. If you're getting data from external sources, or even you're validating your own data. Validating attributes and attribute values, checking mandatory fields, checking domains that are, correct. Geometry, well, that's just a huge open can of worms there in terms of geometry quality. And that means different things to pretty well any format that you're writing to. And then there's also the relationship between data, particularly on the geometry side, how data interacts in topology, in the sense of topology or networks. And then on top of all of that is, are you just validating single features? And that's where the attribute validator and the geometry validator in FME come in. And the other thing is, are you validating relationships like topology relationships, or even relational data relationships? So what are you validating against? Do you have a standard? Like if you're receiving CAD data from engineering CAD designs, are you validating against a CAD standard? Are you validating against your geodatabase data model? What are you validating against?
Yeah, let us know in the question panel there, and hopefully these questions will help spark questions of your own as we go into the Ask Me Anything portion here. All right, and I'll just head back to this how to ask questions slide in the meantime. So if you do need to refer back, we'll leave this up. And with that, it looks like we've already had a couple questions come in here this morning. So why don't we go ahead and dive in? So the first question here is what FME tools or transformers are best for completing data validation? Great question.
Who wants to lead that one off? Yeah, I think I'll start off with a couple of suggestions here. I think there are a lot of different transformers for this task. Obviously, there are a couple of the main players, so things like the attribute validator, the geometry validator. There's even format-specific ones like the JSON validator, and I think XML has one as well. So it really depends on what you're trying to validate against. It kind of comes back to Mark's question. Is there a geodatabase specific operation that you need to do? Do you need to first expose any format attributes to get things available? Do you need to enable some parameters in the reader to make the domains available? Things like that kind of come to mind for me. So it can consist of a host of different transformers. Obviously, the key validation transformers aren't really the limitation there, because it can come down to what format attributes are holding some data too. So, Mark, Dave, any other thoughts there?
On a bit of a deeper level, for string validation, we have several transformers that support regular expressions: the tester, the attribute validator, the string searcher, etc. And regex expressions can be very powerful at defining a sort of range of values that you want your attribute data to have. So instead of setting up a whole bunch of testers, you can craft a regular expression that covers all of your bases and pretty much eliminates all the stuff you don't want. And that can be very helpful in a sort of one step. On the downside, the regular expressions can be quite complex sometimes, and it takes a while to sort of get used to them. Most of the transformers that support regex, FME has a sort of little playground in there where you can put in the sample data and work with your expression and see what it covers. So I'd recommend that for string data. Mark, anything?
Yeah, I like the database joiner, and we've seen several patterns from some of our partners and others who have used this. So what you can do is you can build lookup tables. So say you're validating domains, you can have a lookup table that has all the domain values in there. And then when you read in your data, you can take the value that that's on your data and look it up against that lookup table, and it falls in with the range or the list of domain values that are valid, then it's valid, and if it doesn't, then you can reject it. So that can be done with all sorts of things. It can be done with attribute names, attribute values, domains, a really powerful technique. So yeah, the database joiner is a great way of doing that, so that you externalize the lookups to what is valid and what is not valid.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is definitely a little bit of a loaded question, because even some things came to mind as Dave was responding to that with regards to regex. We also have the ability to connect to anything with a REST API as well. So if you're looking for something like an email verification service, something like Kickbox, that's something that you can connect to if you just use the HTTP caller. All you have to do is fill out, I think it's just client ID and secret, and you can essentially validate any email address. Of course, that's not the only place you can go with this. You could use any other validation service as well. So if there are specific ones that are based on a REST API or a SOAP API, you actually have access to those as well. So you're not really limited with only the tools that are in FME here. You can expand its capabilities. So
yeah, when it comes to things like geometry validation, I think two of the most powerful tools, generally the ones I use the most, are the Topology Builder and the Neighbor Finder. And those are kind of like initial state kind of transformers, in that once you run them through that they provide all the information that you can then validate with. So the Topology Builder will build up a sort of ArcNode model of the topology, and then you can query the features afterwards to see if they're fitting in their respective spots, or if they have the kind of topology you're looking for. The Neighbor Finder gives you sort of the same thing as to features that aren't attached to each other, like are you within a certain distance of other features? What's the direction to your closest feature, that sort of thing, and that can be very powerful for doing geometry validations.
And Suzanne's asked a couple of great questions. Going back to the regex, where's the support website for regex? Where's the Safe Software support site for regex? Well, I don't think we actually have one, and that's because there are so many tools for checking regex expressions. And actually, I would say that in our string searcher and our string replacer, we have a very nice little tool for checking your expressions. But if you want to dig deeper, I think all of us have our own favorite website. There's many of them. If you just search for regex tutorial or something like that on the internet, there's loads of great regex. And I just put in, I should put it into the chat, my favorite one. How do I put something into the chat here? And then I think everybody else has probably got their own favorite site. So this is mine, because it breaks down your expression. And the other great thing about regex is that if you're trying to do something, or you validate a URL, if you look it up on the internet, somebody has built a regex expression for validating URLs. So then you can take that, put it in a tool like this one that I put into the chat there, and see if it works for the kind of data that you're working with. So if anybody wants to throw up into the chat their favorite regex sites, it would be kind of interesting to see the spread. And I think in one of our data quality webinars going way back, did a bit of a regex example, maybe in a user conference or something actually. And so that was fun. There were tons of sites that came up when we did that.
Yeah, and Stack Overflow has quite a number of answers on regular expressions as well. So.
Yeah, can confirm that, because that's usually how I build mine.
I think half of my job is cutting and pasting from Stack Overflow.
All right, moving on to our next question here. How do I apply FME's spatial ETL capability to data validation projects? It's a big question, but a great one.
Yeah, there's a lot of different operations that you can go with here. So this is, I'd say it depends on what you're trying to do in terms of spatial validation here. So things like, we actually have a whole tutorial series. I think it breaks it down into 20 separate articles that shows you how to handle all different spatial issues, things like overlaps and undershoots or gaps. There's all different transformers for this, as well as things like removing spikes from line data sets. So I can actually grab that link to that tutorial, because that is one powerful one that I always go back and refer to, because we do have so many different transformers for this that usually sometimes multiple can perform the same action, but there's a more preferred way to do it. So I'll grab that link and send it in the chat.
Awesome. All right. And while we're waiting for some more questions to come in here, we do have another poll for the audience here this morning. We'd love to know, what is your biggest data quality challenge? So you'll see a few different options here pop up on your screen. And if it's other, let us know in the question panel. Okay, it seems so far spread between two options there. We'll give everyone a few more moments here.
I think this also comes back to what Mark was saying earlier too, with always validate the data sets you're receiving. We actually got an interesting comment from one of our attendees, Stan, who mentioned to never trust the data that's been handed around the third, fourth, fifth, etc. time. Only trust and verify it from the original data owner. So that's kind of consistent with the results we're seeing in this poll here.
Yeah, I think another advantage FME adds as far as an ETL tool is that we can access a lot of data in its, I guess, natural state or natural location, rather than relying on, say, a derived output to do any of the validations on. So we're sort of getting our information as close to the source as possible.
Yeah.
Going back to Chris's thought there, does that include PDF files where data goes to die?
I would say so. We can read PDF. Why not? Add it to the party.
Yeah.
And I'll close
often
that.
people have to drag data out of kind of reporting formats, as I would say, and I think that's probably a bad thing to do if you can help it. So PDF, KML really, which is a reporting display format, so the data is often being simplified in some way. Probably if you can avoid those kind of sources, Excel goes on both ways because it's both a data repository in many cases, but it's also a reporting tool. And so those reports would potentially simplify the data or munge it in some way. So avoiding those end formats is probably a good thing.
We can add those to the messy scattered data answer.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And the other thing I might add is it hasn't come up yet, but we have a lot of XML validation tools as well. So I don't think any of us here are XML experts, maybe Mark, but there are tools that we can validate XMLs against its XSD and just make sure that your XML data sort of conforms to its specifications.
All right.
It's a relatively quiet bunch today, so I'm concluding that everybody in the audience must have above average quality data, which means that somewhere out there, and not in this audience, somebody has below average quality data, because that's the definition of averages. So what I would suggest to the audience is that as soon as you're also quiet, that you probably need to start validating your data, because not everybody can have above average data. We all think our data is great until we start really looking at it closely.
Somebody brought up here a lack of standards enforcement for CAD submittals, and oh yeah. Yeah, well, yeah, CAD is I mean, it's a very powerful tool, but it does seriously lack any sort of standard enforcement. Its flexibility is in some way its biggest problem when it comes to that, because you can do anything in CAD and you probably shouldn't. So yeah, I mean, there are ways you can build up processes in FME to validate your CAD. A lot of times you're validating against the standard, so you can check your layers, make sure they fit the layer list on the standards. Sometimes if you get your standards in Excel data, you can use the tool Mark was mentioning before, the database joiner, to actually read your Excel, validate your CAD against that for layers and block names and such. For topology, yeah, there's usually a lack of topology in CAD completely, but you can check that and to see what little there is. Absolutely.
I've just put into the chat a webinar we did a long time ago with some customers, and that's a large chunk of that is around CAD validation that they had to do for their pipeline designs, and give some really great ideas on that. There are open standards out there on CAD, National CAD standard, the US standard. Here in BC, there's a group, MMCD, which I can never remember what that stands for, municipal something. They're trying to get a kind of a CAD standard for municipalities up and running, so that they can get engineering drawings coming in and standardized. And usually the best approach is a carrot and stick approach. We've got a couple of examples on FME Server, I think, actually, which illustrate how somebody can deliver a CAD file. You can run it past some sort of validation process that might hook to a standard, and then either send it back or accept it if it passes.
Yeah. And one nice thing about FME is we don't necessarily stop at validation. Once you've identified the problems, you have the toolkit, you can go on and then say to fix the problems, especially when it comes to like renaming layers or replacing blocks, etc.
All right, looks like we do have a question here. I am trying to recalculate root measures from multiple counties to one statewide measure along the digitized direction, i.e. at each county line, the measure restarts at 0. Where does one start?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. We have measured tools. We have tools that can work with measures within FME. In that case, I would almost work with multiple measures. So that's the other thing FME is, it can handle multiple measures. So I would keep the original measure and probably generate new measures just based on the new lines you get themselves. Maybe you can use a line joiner, etc., to sort of generate that, to join those together before you generate the new measures. Once that's done, I'm trying to think, there's no real, we don't yet have a measure expression evaluator, sort of way to work with the math on the measures, but that is something you could sort of dig down into Python and use a Python color to work with a bit as well. But yeah, that is something you could do with FME. It's a bit more complex than the sort of regular problem. But if you want to follow up with support offline after this, I would love to have a go at this one.
Awesome, and it looks like we have a whole flurry of questions that just came in here. So the next one on the list here is, I'm working with property tax data. What is the best way to validate input string data that doesn't match for either addresses or names?
Well, that's really difficult. So you got a really difficult problem right there, I think. But you've got to look for the patterns. So like what's in that string data? Is it the property portfolio? That's the most important thing you want to pull out. Is it the street name? Is it the dollar value? So so those are the things you need to try and identify. You know, how do you want to split out this string into various components? So that's one thing to identify. And then going back to Dave's regex, that's really what you're going to have to go fall back on there. And it might take a few expressions. You know, you might have to pull out property portfolios, folio numbers with one regex, deal with that, and then do that again for the address or something. Yeah.
We also have, it's a custom transformer, but we do have some fuzzy string matching tools. I believe it's the fuzzy string comparer. It's on the FME hub, and that uses the Python's fuzzy string matching, and that might be helpful there. So you out of that you get a sort of a percentage match, a number on the two strings, and then you can set a limit to, yep, these match, and oh no, that's not it. And then you can adjust that limit. Sort of, you might have to do some testing and stuff to find out where that limit is for your data set. Let's see, there was somebody just came across the support a few weeks ago who'd actually implemented something called the Guth algorithm for string matching, which looked really kind of interesting. And sort of custom algorithms like that for string matching can be used, especially if there's any, if you know any Python modules around, we can grab those as well. But again, we can get very deep into the woods on this, but the fuzzy string matching might be quite helpful for you. Awesome.
Headed to the next question here. I would like more understanding of the value in the underlying FME parameters to expose for a data set. Can you provide a resource that has an example of these underlying parameters? And then they've put in brackets FME underscore.
So I believe that's for the FME format. The FME format attributes. I believe that's what that's referring to. That we do have all this in the documentation, so we can go ahead and get that link and send that out in the chat. But for the most part, all of the FME format attributes are pulled from the source. So in the case of an AutoCAD file, there'd be something called AutoCAD underscore color, and that's storing the color for that particular feature. To make sure it's consistent in FME, that's when we pull that into an FME color attribute. So it's essentially doing the same thing. It's pulling from those source data sets and just mapping it to what our equivalent is. Dave, correct me if I'm wrong here. There might be a little bit more intricacies to it than that, but that's my general understanding. And we do have some documentation that we should explain that further in.
Yeah, the FME format attributes are kind of the generalized ones that we've extracted. So say for text, you'd have FME text size, FME text height. So we grab the stuff that's sort of most common. But going a bit further, the format attributes themselves, and those are the ones that are, again, prefixed with the format name, say your AutoCAD underscore, which don't appear normally as your schema. But in some formats, like especially CAD, that's where the bulk of your information is, because CAD generally doesn't have, user attributes on the schema. Also, some formats like KML, a lot of the information is in those format attributes. So by exposing those, and you want to basically be validating on those attributes as well.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'll just add here as well too, when you are previewing the data, whether it's in Visual Preview or the Data Inspector, you can see all this information in the format or the feature information window. So it kind of tells you everything that's going on there. And you'll kind of notice that most of them will have a matching feature attribute. So that's where you can kind of see how those all map across. So.
Awesome. Okay. Another question here. I am working on creating an AR file for FME AR. My data is currently in feet coordinate system, and FME AR is in meter. What is the best way to convert my data into a metric system?
So that's a really good question. When it comes to the units of each data set, that's all based off the coordinate system. So all of this information is actually stored in the coordinate system definition. You can simply add a reprojector to the canvas and reproject it to any coordinate system that's in meters. I believe FME AR actually has a specific, I'm just checking in the documentation right now, has a specific coordinate system that it does reproject to. It's AZMED, or for the Americans, AZMED. So that just is a meter-based, I'll send that out in the chat as well. That's just a meter-based coordinate system that you can essentially convert all of your units to. If you have any attributes that are stored in feet and you want those to be displayed in meters, you should be aware that that's not going to be reprojected by the reprojector. Instead, you'll need to use an attribute reprojector, which of course just reprojects those attribute values, and it should convert them to the appropriate meters or appropriate unit for your data set. Any other thoughts for that one, or is that all good? All right, I think we're good with that.
Awesome. Okay. Next question here. How can I check if the start and end point of a line have transposed between versions of the file?
Oh, a starting point would be the change detector. Look for changes in the geometry. And then there might be other changes going on, so that's okay. But then those features that did change, you could then just basically compare the start and end coordinates. So there's a coordinate extractor, I think it is, Dave, is it?
Yeah, you can extract the coordinates and compare them,
and then just compare those directly. Again, potentially with a test filter or another change detector, but I think a test filter would probably be better.
Yeah, or another, this one is a pretty specific case. We have an orienter transformer that you can actually switch the line around. So yeah, you could check for changes and ones that have changed, run it through the orienter and see if it is no longer changed, and then you know that it is basically being transposed.
And then getting a bit more sophisticated, the Topology Builder also builds topology if you've built the topology of your two networks, and then it flags the lines whether they're going in or out of a point. And so I can't remember exactly how that's done. I think it's just whether the node ID is positive or negative or something. But
Yep.
That would be an easy way to check those node IDs and see if they have changed. That would tell you whether the orientation has switched.
Okay, the next question here. What is the best way to search feature classes for features with null geometry, i.e. linear features with no length?
Oh,
I think the geometry filter should catch that, doesn't it?
well, we can catch true null geometries, but yeah, this is a little bit different definition of what we consider null. So I'm trying to think what will do that to the geometry. Say you have a line with no distance. The geometry validator is a very powerful geometry tool. And there's a bunch of validation tools in that, and one of them is to search for what we call degenerate geometry, and that will find that particular case.
Okay, next question here. Do you have any tool to validate / repair geometry for Esri and OGC environments in file geodatabase?
Well, I think that the geometry validator I just mentioned is quite a powerful tool to both validate, and it will do repair. It will attempt to repair if it can. So for something like the, say, degenerate geometry, it would take that line with no distance and turn that into a point feature to make, to keep it consistent with its actual geometry. But yeah, that would be where I would start, is the geometry validator. And we also used to have, I don't know if we still have that. We had a tool that was, I'm trying to remember the name of it, and it would round the data to match your, and this is more for Esri, to match the granularity of your GDB file. And it was a way of sort of reproducing what the Esri writer would, like what rounding it would do on the output. And so you could do that rounding ahead of time and then check for things like polygon crossings and stuff that were artifacts of that rounding. Quite frankly, at the moment, I'm blanking on the name of that tool. Let's see if I can find that. Well, you guys answer other questions.
Sounds good. All right, in the meantime, so here's the next question. Is there a good way to look into multiple SharePoint sites? I know FME has a SharePoint online connector, but I believe it cannot connect to multiple sites at the same time.
Mm-hmm. So that is a good question, whether it is SharePoint lists or you want to actually get to the files themselves. The list reader and writer will be a single site at a time, whereas the SharePoint online connector, if you're handling for files, it's the same concept where it's only going to be able to reach out to one site at a time. So the way you would essentially get by that would be to use multiple SharePoint online connectors. This would allow you to set specific subsites if you want to reach out to specific subsites. Same thing goes for the reader and writer in this case. It's just whether you're handling files or lists. But yeah, the way you could handle that would be either multiple of the transformer or reader or writer, or if you have the actual name of the site stored as an attribute value, you could essentially set the parameter of the SharePoint Online connector transformer based on an attribute value. So if you know the name of the site or the subsites that you need to reach out to, if those are stored in an attribute, you can pass that attribute into the site and the document library parameters, and it should update for you as the workspace runs. So a couple ways to do that.
Could you do that for the SharePoint lists in the feature reader, possibly?
Yeah, with the feature reader too, yeah. So in the In the reader, you can't technically set it based on attribute values, but as Mark mentioned, we do have the feature reader transformer, which is essentially the transformer version of a reader. It's baked in, so you can essentially put it in mid workflow and allow your features to continue going through. Same thing goes for the writer as well, so you can set things dynamically based on attribute values that way. Yeah, I'm a big fan of the feature reader and feature writer for that reason.
Okay, next question here. What workflows work for quality assurance? Are there ways for editors to run their own validation on edit versions, perhaps via server before their edits go into the corporate data?
So that's a bit of an interesting one. Yeah, Mark, go ahead. There, I'll let you lead off.
I think the questioner has answered the question there, FME server. And we have a little demo on our FME server here, so I'm just going to put that in there. And so basically it's a directory watcher approach on FME server, so people can drag a CAD file or whatever onto, in this example, it's a CAD file onto the site, and then it will run that CAD file through the validation process, and from there tell you whether there's got bad data in it or not.
Mm-hmm. And just to add to that as well, with that demo that we have on the page that Mark sent out, that is simply for validating and producing a report. You can have it, for whatever reason, if it fails and you want to put all the good features into an edit database or a non-production database, you can do that. You don't necessarily have to end the workspace with the HTML report there. The same goes for if it passes validation. You can put it directly into the appropriate database table if you want it to. So kind of depends on what your setup is. If you want to have it go to straight into a production database, that might be a little risky, but you definitely have that option with those server apps to do that. So.
All right, next question here. If you had a hexagon that had its coordinates looped back on itself unintentionally, so it looked like a line when it should be a closed hexagon, for example, would FME be able to see that the vertices were looped back and correct for it?
I think you could do that with the self-intersection check in the geometry validator, because then it would look for any lines that lay on top of each other or across each other, and that would likely be sparked in this case.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I guess this would just be checking for if the polygon exists. So if it's a line or if it's a polygon. So yeah, I think we actually cover that in the geometry. I think I sent it out in the chat a little bit earlier on here. It's the tutorial called Tutorial Data Validation and QA with FME. I believe that use case is actually covered in there. So it should cover self-intersecting lines and have an article for that. It might not be a hexagon, but it'll be close.
All right, next question here. We're in the process of cleaning up and managing better data for our Esri Enterprise geodatabases. And one of the data quality parameters I'm interested in is feature class, added with metadata, I believe. Another value I'd like to capture is how many rows each feature class contains. What would you suggest as an approach?
Well, to add up the rows in each feature class, you can use the statistics calculator is probably the easiest way. That actually calculates a whole range of statistics on your features. And you can calculate it on, I mean, you're just summing the number of rows coming in. That's fairly simple. You can do actually more sophisticated statistics as well on that.
If it's an enterprise database, you could just do a SQL call and ask for the row count.
Oh, that's true.
And so that would be the quickest, but if you want more, using the statistics calculator should be good. One of the parameters on the geodatabase reader, the enterprise geodatabase reader, is to read the metadata. So instead of reading data, you can just read metadata. And I think that comes back at you as an XML blob that's in some standard. I forget what that standard SDF something. Anyway, and then you could analyze that XML as well to make sure that all the bits were in there that you were looking for, like coordinate system or whatever.
All right, another Polygon question here. When writing to a Polygon geometry writer, some of the polygons are not being written because these Polygon geometry are IFME multipoint instead of IFME polygon. What is the best way to resolve this issue to be able to send all polygons to the Polygon writer?
If you're getting a
Well, multi-points on aggregates, I think. So I think there is an aggregate filter, is there?
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
On the geometry filter.
Yeah, you could filter for aggregates, you can deaggregate, and if you just want to force them. The multi-point instead of the polygon, though, I think is the kicker there.
Yeah, the aggregate filter should filter out the multi-points. The geometry filter should tell you whether you got a polygon. So yeah, I think you can go either way. I think I would filter, do I have a polygon? And go that way. If it's a multi-polygon that you mean, then again, the aggregate filter, I think, will pick that out and it will tell you whether it's an aggregate or not. And then you have to deal with that, the deaggregator or something. Yep.
Okay, next question here. Is there a best practice to validate data that comes in over time? For instance, when property violations are posted to the database each day, are there tools to pick out the most recent files from the last 24 hours from an existing data field?
Yes, I think there's a couple of different contexts here. So depending on what your source data set looks like, if it has a creation date or a last update and it's from a database, you could use a where clause. That would be probably the most simple approach to that. If it's file-based, you can still definitely accomplish this. You'd have to use the path reader or path data set. Get the proper name here. Directory and file path names. The short name is path. That's a reader that'll essentially reach out to your file directory and get a list of all the files along with when they were created, updated, last updated, things like that, all the metadata there. So you can filter for basically anything that was within the last 24-hour window using the just a tester and the date timestamper to calculate what the current date is. So there's a couple of different ways you can handle that. And then to actually read the files in and process them in the workspace, you again come back to that feature reader transformer, because the path reader will provide the data set, full path to the data set, and you send that into the feature reader to actually do the work on it. So yeah, any other tips there from your side, Mark or Dave?
No, except that I always forget the name of that reader as well.
Yeah. Yeah, I always just type path on the canvas, it's easier.
Okay, next question here. I need to add attachments to an ArcGIS database. However, I would like to set up an FME that would run once a week to check the date modified and only replace PDF attachments that have been modified in a certain time frame, like say the last 7 days, for example. Any suggestions?
On the purely, I mean, there's some, yeah, if it's an enterprise database, you could use a SQL query. But I mean, from a purely FME and workspace point of view, we do have date time tools. So you could extract the records, you could check their date times, and then also use the directory and file path reader that Chris just mentioned. One of the options there is to get the sort of metadata information included in there is the last modified time. So then you could check your PDF, check the last modified time, check the date timestamp in the Arcgis, and then update the ones where the file is newer than the record. Let's see yeah, we have a date time calculator that allows you to look at 2 date times and figure out whether the distance between the two.
All right, and a couple last questions here. If you do have any questions still on your mind, definitely get those in now. And we'll proceed with these next questions here. So could you explain any tips for how to take advantage of parameters?
I imagine that's for published parameters and not the transformer parameters. I think we'll all have slightly different answers here. So Dave, I kind of cut you off. Do you want to go first?
No, I was just saying, I mean, parameters come in when you're, I guess, most helpful if you're sort of running things in batch mode, or, you're publishing up the server and you're exposing the parameters for your users to fill in. But the nice thing about it is that you can take any of the parameters that you need to set in any of the transformers or any of your readers and writers and publish them up for the users to fill in. With a little bit of work, you can actually compound your parameters. So, I mean, you can have several parameters that together fill in a single field. So if you want to say that the transformer is asking for a particularly complex parameter, and you would like to split that into several pieces, you can do that by creating the parameters on your navigator, and then in the parameter in the transformer, you can pick off the box, use a text editor, and then paste your parameters plus whatever sort of gluing together characters you need to fill that in. So there is a myriad of ways you can use parameters to simplify the usage of your workspace. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it also makes it essentially more flexible too, as Dave was mentioning. When you're publishing things up to FME server, when you do make use of those published parameters, it really allows your users to drive the flow of the workspace, because they're essentially entering in what they want the values to be set as. Just to add to what he mentioned as well, in the navigator, we do have that section called user parameters. If you right click on there, depending on the version, it might be create new user parameters, or if you're in, I believe it's 2021 or newer, there should be an option called manage user parameters. That'll open up a new dialog that you can create a whole different type of published parameters. So there's different groupings. There's choice, there's color, date, time. You can do file based, you can do passwords, text, and even geometry. So you can allow your users to draw geometry on FME server. So yeah, the reason I was saying there's going to be a bunch of different answers with this is there are a lot of things you can do with published parameters. So it is all what you want to accomplish here. But we do have a good tutorial that I sent out, and I can send that out in the full chat as well in case other users are curious about published parameters.
All right. Next question here. How do I write geometry, mix curves, and lines?
Sure, I'll step in on that one. We have a geometry in FME called the path geometry, and the path geometry is essentially a linear geometry that is a mix of lines and arcs. So if you have your lines and arcs as separate pieces, you can send them into just check here. I believe it's the path builder, and it will connect them all together into a single path. And if you're writing out to a format that supports paths, like say AutoCAD or GeoDatabase, they will go in as the proper feature. So you get a single line made up of those different elements.
Awesome. And I'll give the panelists a moment here to quickly skim over the latest question that's come in, because they do provide some more details in the example there. And I'll read out the gist of it here. With GIS data hosted features, maintaining metadata can be burdensome. I'd like to use FME to read in an Excel file or SQL table with all the metadata feature classes /AGOL items metadata, and then populate the various GI records with the metadata. Any advice on that question there that's come in? Maybe we'll give the panelists just a moment here to read through that. I know there's some more details that have come in from Joshua there.
Well, I was just looking. I think the answer to that, it will depend on the format that you're actually dealing with. I mentioned earlier on the EGDE, which is the Enterprise Geodatabase Reader, we can read metadata, but I'm actually not sure whether we can write it back in the same way. I believe we can. I believe that's set on one of these nebulous format attributes that we were talking about earlier on. So I think on the Enterprise Geodatabase that can be done. Arcgis Online, I'm not sure whether we would be able to write the metadata there. That could probably be done using the HTTP caller to hitting their REST endpoint, so you could probably fudge it there. File geodatabase, I'm not sure.
All right, and it looks like 2 questions here remaining. What is the best method for bill of material? I need to count all points for each feature class and sum all the lengths of the lines for each feature class inside Polygon. The writer will be Excel.
Yeah, then in that case, the statistics calculator is quite useful. Before that, you would probably want to, if you don't have an attribute with the length on it, you can generate an attribute with the length on it with the length calculator, and then run it through the statistics calculator, grouping it by the feature classes, and then from that you can get a sum of all the lengths for each feature class.
And the second half of that question is kind of a spatial join, really, asking the sum of length of lines that, I think the way I'm reading that, the sum of lines that fall inside a particular polygon. So that's a spatial join, and then find the length of the lines that actually fell inside that area. So that's the length calculator. And again, using the statistics calculator like Dave suggested.
All right, and last question here that's come in thus far. Metadata is so difficult to manage in ArcGIS/AGOL. I sympathize with that recent question, but also am trying to develop a systematic way with FME to manage. Maybe that's more of a remark than a question, but I thought I'd mention that. All right, and with that, just as a thank you for everyone joining us this morning, we do have a community badge that you can redeem. Today's code, WFLCB, and we'll get that in the chat here momentarily. And the peak of data integration. So our 2022 UC is August 24th to 26th. If you have yet to register, I believe there's a little bit of time left in early bird savings, so definitely be sure to do so. We'll drop that link in the chat shortly as well. And lots of great upcoming and on-demand webinars at safe.com/webinars. Thank you so much to our team of panelists here this morning and to all of our attendees. A lot of excellent questions that came in this morning. If you do have any last-minute questions that come up, feel free to drop those in the question panel. We will stay online on the back end for a few more minutes here, and also an opportunity for you to save out any links from the chat there. So with that, I will bid you all adieu, and thank you so much for joining us this morning.
All right, thanks so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.